And so by observing this, I find many problems can be relieved by working on the opposite side. Quite often, that becomes a right hip problem, where if I build a left side strength and dexterity and concentric movement forward, then it'll relieve a lot of those pains on the right side.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to the Undercurrent podcast, and in this episode, I'm joined by Bert Massey, and Bert and I are going to talk today about the biomechanics that underlie effective and efficient sports movement. So we're talking a lot about athletic performance, about the factors that lead to elite performance and efficient and graceful and powerful movement, as well as the factors that lead to the opposite of that, less efficient, less effective, and possibly injury-inducing or causing movement. And Bert has a very rich experience in training as a strength coach. He's studied directly from numerous people who I also respect and look up to. I've gotten to know Bert very well over the past several years here in Austin, and he works with a wide range of clientele from elite high school, college, professional athletes to busy executives, and helps a wide range of people with their goals. And in the last few years, he was already doing really excellent work in this space, and in the last few years, he has started incorporating the newbie, and we've worked even more closely together. And are actually this weekend, as we're filming this podcast, we're taking a little break from filming a course on the biomechanics of elite athletic performance and athletic movement. So, Bert, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here this weekend.
Thank you for having me. I couldn't be more grateful to be sitting here and having this conversation.
Awesome. So let's dive into this discussion of biomechanics. Can you share what you see as being the biggest themes in biomechanics, or what's kind of most important, just to help direct this conversation? What's most important in terms of helping create good athletic movement, that solid foundation of athletic movement that can help athletes in all sports across all domains?
I think training and training those movements and training the specificity of those movements, where there's a gentleman I learned a lot from, and his name is Pat Davidson. And he comes on and he basically has an idea with his book, Rethinking the Big Patterns, where at any point in time, I could be doing an exercise with a client, and you could pause me at any point during that exercise and say, Bert, what are you trying to train, and what are you trying to do with this exercise? And I could tell you that, well, in this particular exercise, for example, I'm training single leg stability and rotation on the right leg. And I would say, perhaps specifically I'm working on a transverse plane of motion movement. I think oftentimes we look at training as this bench press, squat, power clean, maximal strength, maximal power, and that is completely represented by how much weight you lift, where we miss a lot of things in the teaching trainers as they're coming into the business. We don't teach them these deep biomechanical understandings of asymmetry in movement, and being able to get to the far outside of your left foot and then transition all the way to the far outside of your right foot, be that in like a cut or in like something as complicated as like a pitch delivery motion.
So let's talk about, well, first of all, when you say training, getting specific, let me just confirm, so for everybody listening, when people hear that, they might think specific, like, oh, I need sport-specific training for my golf swing, whereas I believe when you say specific, you mean getting very specific on the underlying patterns
There you go.
that of rotation, asymmetry, like you said,
Right.
being able to get out on the left foot. So it's not necessarily training the skill, but we're still focused. If this is a pyramid that we're building, we're still focused on the underlying foundation
Correct.
upon which we will then build
Correct.
more specific skills.
Correct. The foundation of sports motion, like you were saying, that if you will, the backswing in a golf club or in golf is very similar in motion to, again, that just the wind up of a pitcher. Mm-hmm. They don't look the same necessarily. One guy's standing bilaterally and keeping both feet on the ground, or he should be, in my opinion. But then you've got a pitcher where he's completely leaving a leg. But in both cases, we're creating this load back onto one foot so that we can, in both cases, propel a ball forward at maximal distance or maximal speed.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. I think that's clear, and I think that sets the stage here beautifully. And I like what you said about the difference too between what most people and programs tend to focus on in training is that bilateral strength. How much can I squat? How much can I bench? Yep. And there is value for that. There's value in building max strength, but that's only part of, if there's 4 or 5 primary traits that we're interested in, and that's one of them. So if we're spending 20% of our time doing that, that makes sense. If we're spending 60, 70, 80% of our time doing that, that's, I think, inappropriate or not the most ideal.
And how strong is strong enough?
Yeah.
And when are you too strong?
Yeah.
And
can you translate it into these patterns that you're talking about?
Absolutely.
So let's go into this example. You already talked about a couple examples where in sporting movements there's this very important element of asymmetry, being able to load up on one side and able to create force and propel the body, the center of gravity, and an implement, whether it be golf club, a baseball, whatever, back towards the other side. Right. And you mentioned being able to get to the outside of the foot. So it might be a good way to go about this is to build it up from the ground up. So
sure.
Can you talk to us about the feet specifically as we go through this asymmetrical movement that underlies virtually everything in sports?
Sure. Starting simple, if you're, say, standing bilaterally, side to side, feet side to side, and something surprises you, and you're gonna take off in a sprint in one direction, you're gonna be able to do that at the foot level by, let's say, something approaches from your right side and you want to run to the left. You're going to then take your left foot and push backwards so that you can then load on your right foot and explode to take off as fast as you can in that direction. Perhaps a better example is stealing a base. You're going to, you're facing the pitcher and you load. If you're running from first to second, it's exactly the opposite. You're going to load over onto that left foot so you can explode and run to the right. And you would do the same thing if you were throwing a football. If Patrick Mahomes is throwing a football, when he rears back to throw that football, at the foot level, his left foot is pronating to push him back into a deep supination of the right foot, or you could say the left side of his body is internally rotating to externally rotate the right side as far as possible. The further he gets back into that right side, and then the more he's able to pull through the left and propel the right, the more power that's going to become. So at the foot level, pronate through the left to supinate the right foot as much as possible. Never leave that foot. So it's very important that the feet are kind of pretty close to flat on the ground until you get all the way to the follow through. So pronate through the left to supinate through the right. I'm creating power so that my throw or my sprint both come from pronating that right foot at the ground level and pushing off or accelerating through that foot. Regardless of what the athletic motion is, it looks very, very similar at the foot level. Golf swings are very much the same way.
So pronation and supination, and this example of Patrick Mahomes, who's a right-handed quarterback, when he's rearing back, cocking his right arm back to throw, that right foot should be supinated. And one important point you mentioned there is we want to keep that, or he wants to keep that big toe on the ground.
Absolutely.
So what happens if the big toe leaves the ground? Because that's a common flaw in supination, right?
You've now, in our course that we're teaching this weekend, we've used this example of a 4-lane highway in the body. And in our example of Patrick Mahomes, he would be pulling back that right arm into his right posterior exterior chain. He has to then, in order to fluidly throw the ball and not be accurate and throw it, up over his receiver. A lot of times you get a quarterback that comes back from an ankle injury and he ends up throwing high a lot, especially if it's a right ankle. And it's because he doesn't want to plant as hard on that inside of the right foot and follow through. So if you pull back and you lose that big toe, you've now lost transition through the foot and your foot has come off the ground. The chain of muscles that react all the way up your body to create the optimal rotational motion or the optimal torque. Some people refer to it as whip. To create that optimal whip, you need to keep that foot and big toe on the ground. Otherwise, in an extreme case, if you pull that arm back and, you could lose your balance going backwards there. You can't then transition back to the left foot. You're too far and you've lost that midline, right? If you're on a highway, keeping with our highway example, you can't jump from the outside to the inside lane. If it's a 4-lane highway, you have to go through the middle 2 lanes at some point. You can't just hop over, at least until we have cars that will fly or jump.
So when you talk about creating this whip effect, I think that's a really important key to athletic movement here. And for everybody listening, you likely have heard this notion of the stretch shortening cycle, or how the body's muscles and tendons and other tissues can store elastic energy like a spring. So if you can load up that right side, it's sort of like stretching a spring. Again, the example of a right-handed quarterback, the same can be true on the other side for a left-handed quarterback, left-handed athlete. But if you're able to really load that right side, it's sort of like loading a spring, and then you can get some extra energy, speed, power going back into the throw, going back into the swing the other way. Some of that is from stored elastic energy, and some of it is from muscular work. So you get a little extra energy, a little extra power almost for free if you can really load this correctly. But it's important that right big toe stay on the ground.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise, when you're going back through, you have a leak in that. Like,
there you go.
A leak in that.
And you're opening yourself up for injury. You're opening yourself up for injury. In the specific case of that right big toe coming off the ground and rearing back for Patrick Mahomes or Bryson DeChambeau or someone who's really trying to get a maximum amount of power from that pull back, the injury that's likely might pop up there is like a right low back problem, because you're not getting that fluid transition. It's kind of more herky-jerky. It's like a race car with a slightly bad engine, or like a loose nut or something. Like, I know nothing about cars, but you get the idea. If something's off in your race car and you're trying to go full speed, there's a lot more chance that likely something's going to go wrong, and that's where injuries present themselves. And I think when people say they're trying to train to prevent injury, using these motions and training these motions, sometimes in very slow, static, isometric even manners, is going to help prevent those injuries, because now the person has a frame of reference as to how to maximally get back to that space that is something other than whatever their sport is. You can't, of course, Patrick Mahomes and Bryson DeChambeau in our examples are ultimately going to throw the football the most to train this movement, or swing the golf club in Bryson DeChambeau's case. But teaching them to do that in a weight room manner and in a slowed down, very specific, very kind of granular training, you're going to improve their understanding of that movement. And then there's that whole idea of where you might train the opposite side for a little bit as well.
Well, let's talk about that. So one of the important things, obviously, Patrick Mahomes loading back has to be able to load that right side. We want to make sure the big toe stays on the ground so that that spring is attached, and it can recoil through the whole length of that from the external rotation, the internal rotation of the leg, hip, and then the opposite rotation of the spine, and the counter, or sorry, the rotational difference, between the thoracic spine and the pelvis.
Twisting.
So we want to get all that loaded. And then talk about getting over to the other side and that follow through, and how important that is for once you've loaded that spring and you're ready to recoil back and capture some of that stored energy, create power going back the other way. Tell us about that phase of the movement, about actually putting force into that implement, into the football or the golf club, and then going over and loading the left side.
I think there's two things that represent this very clearly to me. One's a golf swing and one's a baseball bat swing. Similar movements, but very different. And in golf, I think I'm no golfer, but every time that someone coaches a swing, they're going to coach someone, again, we'll use our example of a right-handed golfer. As you've got that drawback, they're going to coach them to pull through that left side or the front side of the movement. And initiating the movement after the drawback from that pull keeps the person from being too dependent on the side that you've drawn back now. A lot of times what would happen in that, in like a golf swing, is you would hook the ball very, very far, or you would not have the power that you could in your drive because your body would pull up. Same thing in a baseball swing, which I know the home run swing is a little more popular now than it used to be when I was a kid, because when I was a kid, you taught the axe chop and you coached ground balls and everything like that. But we've moved on from that now, and we won't get too specific there. But the same idea, where if you were going to hit a baseball one-handed, you would never do it with your back hand. You would do it with the front hand. There's a kid that lives in Florida, and he only has a full left arm, and I think he drives the ball like 280 yards, something, as like he's 13 years old, and it's all with just his left hand.
That's
so
right.
when
I saw you sent me that video of him. That was cool.
When you initiate those motions, you want to start with that ground force. And that kid, in our example, they took him in I believe it was Real Sports, took him to a PGA center where they trained actual pro golfers, and they put him on a force plate, and they figured out that he created more ground force with his feet than professional golfers do, that weigh far more than him, because he doesn't have the upper body evenness to create that rotation. It all comes from his feet. It all comes from his legs. There's a changing just slightly from Patrick Mahomes to Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers has had one of the best arms in the league and still does for a very long time. But is Aaron Rodgers like the biggest guy in the league? Not at all. He just creates that power from his hips, and that's why and his feet, and that's why he can throw so well on the run.
That's awesome. So for golfers, I think that in that case, if you're not getting the left side, if you're not getting that proper initiation of the movement, I think that would probably lead to a slice rather than a hook. So,
like I said, I'm not a golfer.
We'll get that. Just for context, for anyone who's listening who's an avid golfer, we'll make sure we.
I don't teach swing mechanics. I just teach body mechanics.
Yes, that's right. Well, the cool thing about it is that's the common language among all this. It's like if you do math, if you know math, then you can do a lot of things, from calculus to algebra to balancing books for a business, or it's like the common language there. So
I think you just hit on a major point right there that people just simply don't talk about. We do have similarities in human bodies, and those human bodies, when they do rotational things, even running and walking, it's a similar pattern that goes all the way up. Of course, we all have our individual differences, but if you train those qualities, you're going to improve those qualities.
Awesome. So you've mentioned here a couple really good themes. A big one is the importance of asymmetrical movement, rotational force, and coordinated movement in that rotational or transverse plane, and how we want to spend more time training that. So can you talk to everyone listening now, please, about how that actually informs your training and what you do generally with people in order to, how looking through this biomechanical lens and this asymmetrical lens, how that informs training and what you actually do with people to help them get better in this realm?
Sure. There's a kind of a theme that comes in with like powerlifting and Olympic lifting and weightlifting, and it is creating that lordotic curve in your spine, where optimal rotation almost always comes at a different place, where that lordotic curve isn't necessarily there. You're more in a flexed position. And I think the demonizing and training of the flexed position, where imagine you're looking at someone standing from the side, and you look at them, and from their head all the way down to their pelvis, there's a straight line. You don't have that S curve that we normally have, which is perfectly fine when we're standing. But as far as training is concerned, being able to keep that posterior tuck in the core, specifically the psoas and abdominals pulling on the femur to tuck the hips posteriorly, creates a stage for us to rotate better and not have that low back pain. So I think the idea of increasing ankle dorsiflexion, protecting knees, and strengthening that posterior tuck and then moving off of it, that way you can use that hip hike properly, and you're not going to be irritating the muscles of the low back near as much. I believe that people will be, if you've seen me teach squats, and when I teach squats, I put the person on a wedge. We'll say like a 45-degree angle wedge, or I have them squat downhill, and I have them squat with more knee flexion than is normally taught. And people say, oh, well, you're worrying about the knees there. I respond with, first, I'm directly training the strength of the knees. I'm getting more quadriceps by doing that than you do in a normal squat. But secondarily, I'm taking so much pressure off of that low back. And we get caught up in a world of weightlifting where we try to teach everyone to be a power lifter or to be a weightlifter. And to be the best weightlifter, you have to get really strong in that low back and get really strong in that lordotic curve. But what we lose is rotation sometimes when you train that too heavily. And so what I try to do is, quite often people come to me after, if they're athletes, they've had a history of strength training. And once I look at them, they've lost rotation to one side because of that history of strength training. The perfect example in the general population that everyone likes to bag on is CrossFit. And when a client comes to me with too much CrossFit, they've always got low back pain, and they're always in this very extended spinal position. So getting them back to a flexed spinal position, step number one. And then alongside that...
So in that example, that would be kind of like we talked about before, too much training volume in that bilateral or symmetrical movements, snatches, powerlifting based or Olympic lifting based movements.
Yeah. And I'm not, CrossFit's fine. I'm not bagging on it. It's just a very easy example of, I'm going to do power cleans at maximum speed for 5 minutes, 4 times in a row. Mm-hmm. That's, you're going to train a certain quality there. And that quality is very against promoting more rotation. Mm-hmm. And that being step number one. And after step number one, then I'm going to start training the person's feet. And that leads us into the conversation that you and I have had for years about feet.
So step number one is being able to establish that ability to maintain
body alignment,
an adequate posterior pelvic tilt.
Absolutely.
Because that's the foundation for movement. And when that's missing, that impedes rotational ability.
Yeah, in my own story, right? Like we always kind of can relate things to ourselves very well. I had a history of training, and I had played football and gone into powerlifting and done those things, and that's how I learned to train. And then at 31, I started training in jiu-jitsu. And in a wrestling stance, you're in a very flexed stance all the time. And I figured out very, very quickly that I had an immense strength deficit in a flexed spinal position. So I had to build, and of course from that flexed spinal position, you have to learn rotation. And so there's an example of a sport that my weightlifting history actually, it helped me in the long run, but at the beginning it hindered me because I wasn't able to do the things very strong in a strong way that I thought I was going to be able to do because it's a different body position. Very similar with many sports, honestly. I mean, you're going to be cutting and changing directions so much in sport that if you're only training these static bilateral qualities, you're really going to run into problems with that.
Have you picked up your copy of the NeuFit method yet? In this book, Garrett helps you reconnect with the nervous system and improve outcomes at every stage of rehab and fitness. Based on Garrett's proprietary NeuFit methodology and newbie technology, the solutions in this book will introduce you to a framework for overcoming virtually any physiological challenge. Take the first step in enhancing recovery, boosting performance, and optimizing health in ways you never thought possible. Now available on Amazon in hardback, paperback, or Kindle. And now, back to the show.
So in terms of taking this concept of these concepts of biomechanics and actually implementing them into your exercise selection, your programming progressions, you're starting with some work in a squat on wedges. I've seen you use as little as 10-degree wedges, as much as 30, maybe even 45 wedges. And
that can vary. That can vary depending on the person. You know, the angle of the wedges, I wouldn't list some specific angle.
Right.
And you know, that's the whole foot thing. The foot and ankle leads us to be able to, that supination, pronation conversation leads us to be able to better achieve that hip tuck.
So we're working on that first. So that will actually do some bilateral squatting there with both feet on the wedges.
Yep.
And then you're going to do some work on the feet to promote pronation and supination.
No question. Yeah.
And can you tell us about that for a moment here?
Well, there's a gentleman who's a big inspiration to me, and I learned a great deal from actually at the beginning of, the way life throws something at you. Quite literally, the couple of weeks before, we went into the lockdown in March of 2020, I tore my ACL. And I've then found Gary Ward and his company Anatomy in Motion. And I kind of sat down for those.
He was on, I think, episode 25 of this show.
Right. Yeah, he actually, you guys mentioned my name in there, which made me feel really good. Because it was just neat to do that connection. Two people that I think have largely influenced my career, connecting is really cool to see. And then if I'm even mentioned in a sentence, that's pretty awesome. But Gary Ward and a lot of other people have this thought that we tie our feet up. We basically put them in bindings with arch supports and heel to toe drops. And we have taken away the mobility of our feet, and we've created stiff ankles, and we've forced mobility into knees with these stiff ankles. And if you don't have ankle mobility, your body is going to buy that mobility somewhere. Could come from your knee, could come from your hips, but up the chain somewhere, the mobility that should be in your foot will come from somewhere else. And, that's a real problem with training in shoes and just a really big topic.
So how then do you train the feet to increase that? And we already talked about the importance of pronation and supination. Part of it is using Gary's wedges, right?
Yeah. That and the newbie. Mm-hmm. I mean, that can be very difficult. Yes, you have a lot of bones and muscles and joints in your feet, but it's a whole lot of tendons as well. And we know neuropathy is a problem in the world, meaning people lose neurological function and control of their feet and even feeling. And I believe shoes and wearing shoes for our whole lives, obvious problems with high heels. But I mean, even, Nikes, anything that doesn't give your foot room to maneuver and shift from that pronation to supination is generally like a binding for your foot. And when you bind up the foot, you're going to have to pay for that somewhere up the chain. Might be in the knee, might be in the calf, might be in the hamstring, and that could be even in the neck. I know that Gary talks about that a lot, that, if he can, let's say, take someone with a very high arched foot, and this person has arch supports in their shoes, and they lift and they run and they do everything in that foot is basically like a hoof, and it never gets to move. And that person's now trying to claw at the ground with this stiff hoof when, all those joints and tendons that are in that foot are incredibly important. So it could be something as simple as taking that foot, taking off all the constraints of it, and putting it in a shoe that allows that arch to flatten and pull back. But, but plantar fasciitis and problems with the feet generally terrify people. So that's where I truly think the newbie is really an uncompared machine there. And I spend a great deal of time using the newbie to mobilize and strengthen my clients and my athletes' feet, because it's amazing what you'll do if you fix great example of my climbing partner, rock climbing partner. He likes to hike great deals, and he was wearing Chaco's sandals. And those Chaco's sandals, we would do our newbie work, and I would newbie his feet, and we were working on knee pain, actually, that kind of that patella tendon pain. And he said, when I hike, I don't think it's working. Why do I still have this knee pain? And I said, you've got to take those Chacos off. And he switched from Chacos to a Zero sandal, Xero. And then he kept walking, and now he's been in the Sierras for several weeks, and I think he's hiked 80 miles 2 or 3 times with absolutely zero knee pain, and says his feet feel great. So sometimes it's as simple as working on something like that, and you can really relieve the pain upstream.
Awesome. So we've got a few important pieces falling into place here. We've got that ability to maintain an appropriate pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt. We've got the ability to create motion in the feet, proper pronation and supination in the feet. And that's interesting. One of my favorite ways to describe that is to think of the feet like a megaphone, like an amplifier. If I say something into a megaphone, it gets projected out, and it's much louder the further it gets. And in terms of the feet, 2 or 3 degrees of pronation in the right foot can lead to 5 or 6 degrees of internal rotation of the tibia, which can lead to 10 to 12 or 14 degrees of internal rotation at the hip. So that little bit of pronation in the foot creates, because of the way the bones are connected through the biomechanics, creates this much more significant rotation all the way up the chain, which helps give us this spring-like effect in gait or in rotational movement. So really important there. And then let's talk about the next part of this training progression if we're implementing these concepts to help somebody improve their movement. I think the next thing is going to be asymmetrical stance, right? But you tell us.
Well, it depends.
What's next in your ideal progression here?
I would probably give mention to the shoulders, thoracic, and cervical spine, because we've kind of covered a bit of the core with that posterior tuck, and thinking that, I think reopening the idea with that posterior tuck, that quite literally your core's job is to flex your hips and pull it up. I don't think we as when we learn training and when we discuss training, we don't talk about that enough. That hip flexion is massively important. So I say, matter of fact, we were walking not too long ago, and my father-in-law did this deal where, you kind of have a lip in the sidewalk where it's raised, and he trips over the lip of the sidewalk. And it kind of triggered this thought in me, which is, why do armies march And I'm thinking in my head, and I'm like, well, if you had a bunch of guys marching with packs on their back and they were just slumping down, looking at the ground, dragging their feet, they'd get really tired. Like after a while, there'd be some serious back pain. And if we got to march 20, 30 miles in a day with 80-pound packs on, we better lean back and get those knees up to our chest to keep our abs active. So that, number one, in the core, but then two, also the shoulders. I think a very, very big misconception in both therapy and weightlifting, if I'm being honest, is this idea that we just have to retract the shoulders. The phrase that I hear clients use a lot is the pinch the pencil phrase with the shoulders, when really what I want to teach when we're talking about this athleticism is the best way to get your arm going forward, but to keep that arm connected to your rib cage. I don't think that, if we're talking a skeletal alignment on all of these different things in rotation, I don't think there's enough talk given to the idea of how air and rib cages expand to quite literally touch the insides of the scapulas, which gives more rotational components to the same conversation we were talking about. The further I can internally rotate, in our quarter rack example, the further I can internally rotate my left shoulder to come across, the further I can now externally rotate my right shoulder. So that requires the understanding of how rib cage and shoulder mechanics work. And that I would just say is, lose some idea of the pinching the shoulders and pinching the pencil, and always keeping that down and back with the shoulders, kind of like with that anterior pelvic tilt.
So the ability to then, if we're saying that people are doing too much down and back, we want less of that. We want to work on, of course, the opposite, protracting the shoulders.
Absolutely.
So then give us some of your thoughts on how to train effective protraction of the shoulders.
I mean, let's just look at something very simple as a push-up. Everybody in a push-up gets to that, let me get my shoulders down and back at the top of their push-up before they move. Where I really take a person, if I'm coaching a push-up, at the top of that push-up, I want them to reach those arms forward through the ground and then take their spine up to the ceiling as far as you can get. Imagine it like, you're in some kind of torture machine that's like holding your body against a wall, but then stretching your arms as far forward as you can get. I think just having that thought when doing something as simple as a unilateral or bilateral row is going to be really huge. But then also the thought of like unilateral training in the upper body. Like I have nothing wrong or against a pressing motion, especially, if you want to get on a bench, we can talk about the mechanics of the back of the shoulder. But for the simplicity of what we're talking about, if I have two hands on the bench press at the same time, I might be able to reach further with one arm than the other. So kind of using unilateral motions in the upper body is something I do a great deal of. So just making sure that you kind of teach the reach of the arms, reaching them forward as far as you can, be that in a row or be that in a press. Of course, in a press, it's going to be in the top of the movement, and at the row, it's going to be, the relaxation point where you can really let those shoulders stretch forward, then use the spine to pull back and retract those shoulders.
And so if we're talking about the example of a rotational athlete, which we keep going back to because that's, football, baseball, golf,
jogging,
tennis, that's even basketball.
Absolutely.
Everything. Anything.
Everything other than weightlifting.
Everything, yeah. So that ability to protract, talk to us about how that translates into that ability to get better internal, external rotation in the shoulder as well, because you mentioned that is, and obviously that is
absolutely
a big thing that we're after.
Absolutely, and it's when we talk about that rotational athlete and that drawback, be it in a golf swing or in a quarterback, the further, we mentioned that, the further I can go back into the drawback, the more I can build that spring to propel forward. Well, on the front side of that body in that drawback, the further I can internally rotate that side, the further I can externally rotate the other side. So it's this idea of mirror asymmetry is a word that I've heard Pat Davidson use sometimes. I really like it. It's when I'm throwing or loading to sprint on the right side or swinging a golf club, I want the left side of my body to look internally rotated from the foot all the way up to the shoulder. So the longer I can reach that shoulder, the more internal rotation I can get. Now the more whip I can get going back the other direction when I decide to uncoil the spring. You know, it's that idea of, I know I brought this for our teaching today, but like a bow and arrow. Bow and arrows are great because I'm pushing forward with the one arm and pulling back with the other, which is literally that thoracic rotation. You know, we talked about the upper body exercises. I think pushing one arm and pulling the other at the same time is one of the best possible upper body exercises you could do.
And that literally plays into the motor control of rotation. When you're rotating to one side, if you're rotating to your right, you're looking at your spine. You have your extensors on the right and your flexors on the left are contracting. There aren't many muscles that are pure rotators. It's
right.
The flexors on one side matched with the extensors on the other side. So being able to push or create shoulder flexion on one side and pull and create shoulder extension on the other side plays into that because it gets that almost global pattern along one side of the torso and the upper body, other side of the torso, and that plays into increasing that rotation. Plus, it's also such an obvious example of that metaphor of the spring. I mean, it's cool.
Yeah.
Like we're talking about loading the spring. I mean, literally the bow and arrow is that you put all that effort into loading it and then you let go and you get the return of that energy almost for
Absolutely.
free. So
and we don't think
into a
about that
couple
enough,
things there.
even as something as simple as the qualities of being a bipedal human. You know, there's a lot of writing out there that you can find a lot of different places that really explain we're so unique because we're bipedal humans. Us being bipedal humans is what allows us to throw. It's what allows us to sprint. It's what allowed us, you know, if don't want to get off in a tangent about, you know, Paleolithic hunting or anything like that, but that's what they did. I mean, you really ran down animals so that, you know, our perspiration would allow us to run farther than a deer, not faster, but farther. And then once we got there, you know, you threw a spear at it or you threw a rock or something, and you've never seen a four-legged animal throw something. Even monkeys, like, they stink at throwing. Like, you know, they might do that poo thing, but I don't know how, like, I haven't measured the distance on that. Like, I don't know about the accuracy of that.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing. So we've got recapping some of the pieces of how we actually implement effective biomechanics into training. We're working on the posterior pelvic tilt with squatting. We're working on mobilizing the feet using the newbie and foot wedges. We're working on increasing the ability to protract the scapula on both sides and typically asymmetrically and individually. And that's a really good one, is that example of the bow and arrow, for example. I said example twice there. So then let's talk about one more important piece here. Talk about some of that asymmetrical stance training, whether, you know, split stance, lunge training, or lateral squatting. Talk about that, and then the ability to fully get over onto one side, especially in the context of, you know, why that's important and how that's missing for many people and can cause issues or limitations in movement.
Sure. Twofold. I think I start with the alignment things, because if you start with the alignment, the posterior tuck, the protraction of the shoulder, the pronation, supination of the foot, then your asymmetrical stance should happen pretty well. It should happen far better than if you had missed all of those things, right? So you can't go straight into these asymmetrical stances where I'm training transverse plane at like a maximum power. That's somewhat of a recipe for disaster in some ways. And so you want to make sure you have that alignment. But then once you do, viewing exercises, not so much as if I'm going to say train a split squat, right? That should cause a hike in my hips. And I think oftentimes we've been taught as trainers, oh, you need to look at their hips and make sure their hips stay perfectly even. Why? They're not even when you run. They're not even when you move. So learning and training that asymmetrical stance where my front leg and my stance leg, that hip is not only higher than the left hip, but the more I can train it to be even more higher than the left hip, that's the movement's only going to improve, the rotation's going to improve.
Let me just, for context for everyone listening, let's play this back to gait, just walking gait, which is very simple. So
good call.
If you're walking and you're propelling from your right leg onto your left, so you're about to accept weight onto your left leg is becoming the stance leg. You're going to hopefully contact the ground with the outside of your heel, foot's going to be supinated, and then as you accept weight onto your left leg, the foot's going to pronate as you accept that weight, and as you pronate, your knee and hip flex. You also go into adduction, adduction, but instead of, because the foot's fixed to the ground, you're not doing adduction like we normally think of it, like you're lifting up your foot and bringing it in towards the midline or across the midline. You're doing adduction in the form of a hip hike.
Yeah.
So when your left leg is in stance, your left hip should actually hike up. And so we have this blend of flexion, adduction, and internal rotation, which is the three movements that all eccentrically load, for example, the glute muscle.
Right.
And so that then lengthens the glute, which prepares your glute to help create extension in that push-off phase of gait. So that combination, when you're talking about in a split squat or a lunge type movement, that front leg having the hip hike, that's where that comes from, and that's so important. I wanted to tie it together to gait there, just to lay that foundation, kind of connect the dots for people. So please continue on that when you're training.
No, that's
how that hip hike's important.
You probably said it more technically well than I could. That's exactly what I want. And then there's a question of, do you want to coach that? And you could actually see in that stance, if our example of a split squat, let's use a right leg forward split squat, because that's the easiest for people to imagine. If you were in that stance and all your weight was on that right leg, there would be things that you could check with that alignment. Yes, you could see the hip hike. Yes, if you could see the person's spine, the spine would look like a C curve to that right side when they're doing the split squat.
C curve, the C facing out to the right or out to the left?
Facing out to the right. Okay. So the opening of the C to the right.
Okay.
Because I'm going to pull the hip up, and then if I'm going to coach that hip hike, I can coach the shoulder down on the same side.
Good. I just want to make sure that was clear for everyone.
Yeah. So that's going to pull into our right-handed load of the spring there. The more I coach that, the more powerful the motion gets, which is completely contrary to everything I've read in books and things when I was learning to be a personal trainer, where, we got to keep the spine straight. We got to keep the spine straight. We got to keep the spine straight. No, I'm actually coaching when we start talking asymmetrical stances. I'm actually coaching more curvature of the spine, but making sure that you can do it to both sides. That's the big thing that, a lot of times with an athlete, everyday people, general population, sometimes you get it to where that spine's just stuck and it doesn't curve either way. But if you take a great athlete, and I don't know this about any of our examples that we've used because I've not trained them, but they might be able to create a much greater curve to the right side in that asymmetrical stance than they are to the left side. That's not to say I want to train them to be left-handed or ambidextrous, but I do believe that ambidextrous is ideal in a perfect world, even though we don't live in a perfect world, and Pat Mahomes is never going to be able to throw as well left-handed as he does right-handed. That'd be cool, though.
That's interesting, because we live in a primarily right-handed world, and talk to us about what you observe in the blends of people that you see in your training and coaching. Based on our conversations, it seems like you've observed, and so have I, and it's fairly common that people are more right-sided dominant. People tend to load their right side more.
Yeah.
And how would you actually observe that, or tell us more about one, how that would present, and two, what it means?
It means there's an explanation from a company called Postural Restoration Institute, and they really put a great deal of emphasis on the fact that your liver is down around the lower ribs on the right and in the front, and your heart is up in the upper left compartment. They have an idea that is what creates rotation toward that liver on the right side, and that's why most of the world is right-handed. Doesn't matter whether or not you believe that. What you observe when you start training people, as far as causation, is what you observe when you start training people is people have dexterity in their right hand. People can create movement with their right leg and their right hip. They can open up their right hip far more. If you ask a lot of people, you get a little tricky on the stance stuff, because I like to use the test of asking a client when they debate me on, oh no, my left leg is my strong leg. I say, if you had to kick that door open, what leg would you use? It's almost always right. And what I think the number is like 90-something% of the world is right-handed. And then you've got all the old-timey stuff about left-handed people are sinister and evil and all that.
I used to make people who were left-handed with
right,
the right hand.
Right. And the world is built for us to be right-handed. So you've quickly entered a chicken or the egg argument there, but it doesn't really matter. It's what you observe. And so by observing this, I find many problems can be relieved by working on the opposite side. Quite often, that becomes a right hip problem, where if I build a left side strength and dexterity and concentric movement forward, then it'll relieve a lot of those pains on the right side. And that's just something I've observed over the years, and something I've come to feel pretty strongly about. On the foot end, I think you run into more bunions on the right foot and more collapsed arches on the right foot, and on the left side you run into more high arch stiff ankles. It's not to say it can't be the other way around. You're just going to observe that very often.
And so if someone has a better side, for example, where they can really get into that, loading that side, get that hip hike, get the lateral flexion in the spine to that side, they often will have a side where they're better, and training them to be able to assume that same stance on the other side can be very helpful, because it will help balance out there. Absolutely.
You're not going to, and we're here to talk about athletic performance this weekend. I'm not going to ever take specifically an athlete and tell them how to use their opposite side as if they were ever going to use it competitively. I just want you to be competent over there. I want you to be able to get there. I don't believe that you would ever reverse that process. I don't believe that if Pat Mahomes retires from football tomorrow, he would never do this, by the way, but if he did tomorrow and only started throwing left-handed, I don't think he would ever develop the arm strength on his left side that he does on his right. But we did have a cool example in the Olympics very recently of what we're talking about, where there was the U.S. women's sprinter, Sydney McLaughlin, and she set the world record in the women's 400-meter hurdles. If you go back and look at the story about her, they made her run with, I can't remember whether it was right or left, but she had to jump hurdles with her opposite leg for a year. And she got killed in these track meets and got embarrassed because she'd built her career off of leading. I believe she was leading with her right leg, or it might have been left leg, I'm not sure, but they made her lead with the opposite leg. And she got this new coach and completely trusted him. And she literally went to meets and competed and got crushed jumping with his other leg. And then finally, it's like he took the tape off and it was like, now go. And now she can jump with either leg. And that is the sole reason why she beat Dalilah Muhammad, the other favorite women's 400-meter track hurdler who got the silver medal in the Olympics.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that story.
Yeah,
very cool.
It's really, and there was a similar thing I say when I'm talking about the Olympics now, and based on our discussion, go back and look at the men's and women's 400-meter hurdles. In the men's, there was a Norwegian guy, Karsten Warholm, great name, and Rai Benjamin is the American, and you can watch that race, and in the last 100 meters of that race, you can see Karsten Warholm throw his arms harder and further to get more speed, and he does. And if you go back and watch the whole race, I think Karsten Warholm is switching legs, but he might be just using his left leg. I'm not positive. And Rai Benjamin only jumps with his right. And that's why Karsten Warholm won. Even, I believe I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson even commented on this because he thought it was fascinating, like physics-wise.
Oh, cool. Very good. We'll have to find this and put it in the notes for the show here so we can give everyone a chance to check that out. Cool. Very good. While we're talking about examples of biomechanics in action and how it can help athletic performance, you and I have had this ongoing conversation about the biomechanics of baseball pitching. And can you just let everyone in on this conversation we've been having about how the biomechanics of pitching in Major League Baseball are evolving and some of what's happening there?
There are now, when we were growing up, Nolan Ryan was, man, that's the heater. Nobody can throw as hard as Nolan Ryan, and it was very rare. And then it was Randy Johnson, and you had these guys that were these few handful of guys that could throw 100 miles an hour. Then we had the steroid era in baseball, and now baseball's upset because games are going like 2-1, and these pitchers are just killing these hitters. And there are now more pitchers in the MLB that throw over 100 miles an hour than there have ever been. And we have this example of pitchers coming into the league throwing 94, 95, and then 2 or 3 years later, they throw 103 and 104. These are, 24, 25, sometimes even older. And this has even happened after a Tommy John surgery, where, Tommy John used to end your career. Guys come back, they learn the mechanics, the biomechanics of throwing, how to train the posterior shoulder, and then they come back and they throw harder. So we really have this phenomenon in the MLB where they've always been on the cutting edge of innovation. We can call it cheating in a lot of cases, but they're really looking for an edge all the time. And what they've figured out is they can teach these pitchers proper biomechanics, and when they get those proper biomechanics right, the ball, the spin rate, all of that changes, and they get better and they throw harder. And that is just a completely revolutionary thought in sports that I think you can apply it at any rotational sport, which is what we've been talking about. It just so happens that we have the exact example that we're talking about right now in the major league.
That's awesome, and that's a really really exciting topic for us here at NeuFit. We've had the privilege of working with now 8 or 9 Major League Baseball teams and dozens of players and many pitchers, and so to see this blend of knowledge of biomechanics paired with using the newbie to help them access and activate the right muscles at the right time in that biomechanical sequence is very cool. And we have countless pitchers now using the newbie on their own or with their teams to activate their muscles as part of their movement prep before they go out and pitch, use it to help recover between starts or between outings if they're a reliever. And it's cool to see. So that's a good kind of segue into our conclusion here, where we're spending this weekend.
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
If you think of like pitchers and different windups and things, because I was a baseball player in high school, and so I love thinking about the mechanics of a windup. right? And if you think about the mechanics of a windup, dipping back into like our childhood, roughly, we're close to the same age. Who do you think of the most? And I want to see if it coincides with me.
When I think of windup, the first one that comes to mind is Hideo Nomo.
Dude, that's exactly what I was gonna say.
Because he had the most,
that dude understood the term.
Unique and interesting, right? And exaggerated
yeah.
windup. Yeah.
His eyes would leave the plate.
Yeah.
That's really great because I mean no bull. That is the
funny.
exact.
We didn't talk about
that
this
is
beforehand.
the exact example I was gonna say because he and there is that example of those players that come from Asia like the Ichiro Suzuki. And the Hideo Nomo, there's that granular understanding of that rotation, where Ichiro would only hit it to between shortstop and third for the entire MLB preseason. Like he would just hit it there the whole time, and they'd be like, Ichiro, why don't you, full swing and hit a home run? And he was like, no, I need to get my swing down so that I know where I'm hitting the ball. Mm-hmm. And Ichiro's thing is that he could put the ball wherever he wanted to put it. And now we have, we talked about Hideo Nomo, and now we have Shohei Ohtani, the first guy since Babe Ruth to come along who can pitch and hit. There's no reason why, if you've got a healthy athlete that understands rotation, you can't have guys pitch and hit. I don't know anything about Shohei Ohtani's routine training or anything. I just see it as like a possibility in the world.
Well, he happens to be playing for one of those 7 or 8 teams that we work with there. So
there we go.
I'll just mention that.
Fly me out to work on Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah. Their staff is you're bright and could help them. Fortunately, their staff is really bright. I've gotten to know them.
That's awesome.
Over the years, over the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah, they're doing great work there in Anaheim, in LA.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, that's really, we did a deep dive into some of the biomechanics here, and ultimately that is how we're implementing it, is using this knowledge and these concepts and these exercises with the newbie to help amplify and accelerate. If we have this concept as a coach, as a therapist, of wanting to help somebody improve the ability to hike their hip or rotate onto that side or load that spring and be able to more powerfully create that movement, there's exercises that we can do, and it'll take a while. If we use the newbie, we can get there faster, more efficiently, more safely, get that load more targeted, more precise. And that, of course, is everything that we're filming this weekend, is taking these concepts and combining them with the newbie, using technology to help amplify and accelerate the process of training here. And I'm really excited about what we're filming here. I'm grateful to you for being here and sharing all of this, and you've spent a lot of time, put in the 10,000 hours to really piece it all together and come up with a coherent and effective approach and strategy for assessing, implementing, and improving all of the clients who are in front of you. And everyone who's listening who has a newbie, this athletic performance course will be out in the next couple of months.
Yes.
From the time when we're recording this, we've got a couple pieces, couple modules to film and video editing and such. So sometime around the end of this year,
absolutely,
it'll be out there. And if people want to check you out, Bert, where do we find you on social or at Adapt? We got to give a shout out. So you're using the newbie at Adapt Fitness. We got to shout out our friend Bo Alexander.
Yep, we're in the same city as the NeuFit HQ. We're just downtown, and we have some other things that they don't have here, but they have things that we have. They have things that we don't have here at the HQ. So at Adapt Fitness in Austin, on Instagram at MasseyBV, and just stay tuned to that. There could be a lot more coming out of that pretty soon. So, and thank you again, sincerely. I'm absolutely. It's an honor to be here. I've admired. We've been friends for a long time, but I say when you're not around, and sometimes you don't compliment your friends directly to their face, but what you've created here is amazing. I mean, it's going to change the world, and I say all the time that it's $1 billion machine, because we're talking about it from an athletic standpoint, but the newbie is a truly game-changing device, and I'm just happy to be associated with it.
Awesome. Well, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to work with you. Thank you for coming in and sharing your knowledge, and we really, can all do better and get further together.
Sure.
So
Hope to be back sometime.
If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
That's it. That's it.
It's a great note on which to end this episode. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the Undercurrent podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe if you are into that sort of thing and into the podcast. And if you are, please feel free to leave a review on your favorite platform as well. That helps us get the word out about this podcast and get in front of more people and help share the knowledge and spread the message. Thanks again for tuning in. Thanks, Bert, for being here.
Thank you.
We'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.